with just some beginning remarks from myself, and just to set the context. Before I do that, want to acknowledge that our team at Help Seeker, we're on Treaty 7 territory, and so just acknowledging the opportunity for us to do our work in this space that is stewarded by the First Nations and Métis people in this community. So today's webinar is going to pick up this topic around social responses to COVID. And I know some of you have joined us in previous webinars that had different slants in terms of our focus on emerging challenges posed by COVID and COVID recovery. So today's session is specifically looking at technology. So technology innovations that can positively impact our social recovery from COVID. And so I'm being joined by James from the Institute of Community Prosperity at MRU and Ashif Maui from Rising Tide, and he's joining us from Edmonton. James is joining us from Calgary. They are bringing two very diverse perspectives to this topic, because one is very much in the social impact space and doing some of the deep thinking around ethical uses of technology for social impact purposes. Ashif is very much in the tech development and innovation world from a venture capitalist perspective, and somebody who's been entwined with even the West Coast and San Francisco, Silicon Valley area for a number of years. So he's very much engaged in the Edmonton social tech sector, if there is such a thing, or if there's one emerging. And so I really look forward to hearing both of their perspectives as well. But to set the context, I said it might be a really good time for us to take a look at what's happening across the country around tech and COVID when it comes to social recovery. So I'm going to speak to that just to set the context for everyone as well. So with that, we'll get going. And just for those of you who haven't joined us before, there's going to be a Q&A at the end, but by all means, if you have an interest in a particular question, feel free to throw it into the chat, and especially if those of us that are not presenting can take a look at the chats and keep track of what might be answerable, so that we can keep things engaged and get your questions answered as soon as possible would be awesome. Okay, so a little bit about us, just for those of you who haven't connected with Help Seeker in the past before. We're a B Corp social enterprise that deals with technology and scaling social innovation solutions to complex problems. So we work in different communities across Canada. I know it says there are 100, but old slide, we're actually in 200 communities and still growing in different parts of Canada. And it's still very much a startup. So we've got about 25 staff that specialize in the tech development, data science, and we combine that with some of our work in strategy consulting, change management, research, and social innovation, and everything has that social lens. So we work on homelessness, domestic violence, obviously anything to do with poverty reduction, food insecurity, and we do that through our partnerships at the local level. So it's very much a bottom-up perspective in terms of our approach as well. So just a bit about us, and if you care to find out more about the projects that we're into in different communities, check out our helpseeker.co site. So a couple of the premises that are couching today's discussion, and for those of you that are from the tech world, terms like the fourth industrial revolution will be very familiar. Those of us in the social sector, it may be less so of a term that we use in everyday parlance. And I speak as a social researcher or as a social policy kind of expert / pretending to be expert. But the fourth industrial revolution, and this is again the fourth in a series of major shifts in the way that human society is entwined with economy and innovative technologies and the impacts of those on on social challenges has been well documented in the past, but we're entering this new phase in the fourth industrial revolution because of advancements in the AI space and machine learning in particular, along with other innovations in the biomedical sphere, for instance, and the genetic engineering world as well. So there's lots of innovation and major discoveries happening all the time now that are going to impact the way that our economies work, which of course are going to impact the way our social safety net is able to respond and adapt as well. So that is a major layer entwined in some of the discussions today, and has to be accounted for when we think about COVID, because in some ways COVID has accelerated the good and the bad of the fourth industrial revolution, in particular the move into virtual service delivery, the remote workforce, starting more of that automation of workflows as well. So that is all kind of being compounded and accelerated by COVID. And similarly, the same challenges that we flag in previous industrial revolutions in terms of the income gap, the marginalization of certain populations from wealth or from access to resources, are likely going to become even more amplified, and we're already starting to see that. And so it's a bit of a critique of the march of progress in a way that we need to keep in mind. And I know James has his piece speaking to this in further detail. The other component is this concept of systems fatigue and fragmentation. So we're layering these challenges on top of a relatively fragmented social safety net in Canada, and very likely outside of Canada as well, if we're thinking about things bigger picture. But that fragmentation and some of the major challenges in coordinating services on the ground and having a systems level response are challenging and in some ways fatiguing those of us in the sector. So it's just layers of demand on top of each other on a system that's become quite convoluted over the centuries, still struggles with the vestiges of colonialism as well that have been entwined with charity projects from the beginning of Canada, Canada's formation as a nation state as well. So all of those are part of the premises in today's discussion, or things that we need to think about further. So of course that brings us to the systems as means of maintaining and distributing power. And the social safety net is by no means immune from these power structures and power structure projects as well, that in some ways reify discrimination and systemic racism as well, but also as means of social control. So all of that to say, is technology an opportunity for us to challenge some of some of the negative impacts behind the darker sides of all of these movements? So the impetus, of course, is for systems transformation, and the opportunity that technology brings is also, obviously there's a good and there's a bad. So it's about being aware and critical, but harnessing for the good, because in some ways the revolution in terms of digital transformation has already occurred, and arguably. So it's less about stopping something than getting involved and trying to advance it for equitable reasons. So tech trends and societal impact, changing values in a digitally enabled world. Some of the pieces that folks are thinking about in the broader literature and the tech as well as the social sector engaged in this thinking are listed here. So datafication. So the ways that we're learning to get to know our world are increasingly datafied or seen through the lens of data and big data in particular. And just thinking about that in your everyday parlance, and the way that we use some of the big data coming out of, let's say, Google, for instance. Now it's part of the way that we understand the world, and that wasn't the case 10, 20 years ago for sure. So we've got a whole new layer that's been put on top of our reality as well, and our ways of knowing. The second one is systems of intelligence. So a faster decision turnaround, expectations, data-informed decisions, and analysis. These are pieces that we see in the industry sectors that have already brought on new technologies and new machine learning strategies into their workflows and to the way that products and services become delivered as well. But that's something that's going to be impacting the social safety net and expectations from the communities that we serve. So, why can't I get this online and as a skip the dishes delivery, but why can't I get that as my social assistance or my CERB benefit during COVID? So there's an expectation from end users of us using technology to enable our better delivery of services and enhanced access to services. Another one might be that the use of AI in translation to make sure that some of our touch points are easily accessible in diverse languages as well. So there's an expectation now that we do this work differently using technology. Next one is systems of engagement. So the user interface as a means of engagement. So thinking about your app, just your app use in everyday life, your interactions with Netflix and on TV, and just that is becoming the kind of the consumer norm of engaging with services and systems. So how is that impacting how do we do our work moving forward as well? Of course, the records and the data side of those interactions are not always visible to end users as well. And they, in some ways, with the Facebook scandals, et cetera, you're very likely to be aware of the challenges of not having this visibility and transparency. So how do we get ourselves educated and doing this in the right equitable way? And then the last bullet here, decentralization of information. So there's an increased adoption of technology, even in third world countries. Let's say the access to technology has been is very, very quick and accelerated as well. As technology becomes cheaper, it's becoming something that's much more much more widespread than we would have expected to begin with. The information overload that we sometimes get from our experiences online, et cetera, that's all going to play a role in our ability to be good curators as well of information, because there's no shortage of information. Now, the benefits of AI and machine learning as well, there's obviously the good and the bad, and the ethical use of AI. And I'm not going to steal James's presentation because he's going to go into this in increasing detail. But for sure, we've got an opportunity to leverage AI and machine learning in our work. So the ability to start looking at COVID impacts in an anticipatory way, to think about indicators and what they might mean for our service planning and our systems planning work. That is work that is for us to do moving forward. Again, how do we keep it transparent, equitable, as well as democratized? It's going to be our challenge, especially because we don't have a very solid social tech sector. And for us at HelpSeeker, we're a B Corp, but we interact all the time with tech companies that are not. And so the kinds of questions and expectations that we have around data sovereignty for First Nations, or equitable access and making sure products are easily used in different languages, that may not always be the priority for corporations that have a profit motive firsthand. So how do we influence those tech product developers to have a social lens to their work, but then also how do we leverage some of those tools for the social good as well? Now, obviously for Canada and thinking about us using AI in our social recovery efforts, we've got the ability to use this for an increasing innovation lens to the work that leverages data in a much more coherent and purposeful way that can potentially help us avoid costlier impacts to our social fabric longer term. So thinking about that, if we're able to use data that's already out there to become much more proactive and predictive in our work, we might be able to use it to make a better investments and better service design for our end users as well. So there's obviously a pro and con to all of this. So it's a bit of a call to action for our systems leaders to be on top of these trends and leverage these trends, critique the trends, be constantly involved in these discussions, because they're happening without us right now. So it's inherent that we get ourselves in the room and ensure that the needs and perspectives of diverse populations have a space in those discussions as well. Okay, so I mentioned a little bit about the leveraging of AI in second and third waves and in recovery from COVID as well. So is there a way that we can deploy current resources in ways that are much more entwined with what's happening on the ground, because we'd be able to tap into real-time data sets, for instance, Google Analytics, and understanding what people are actually searching for versus using Statistics Canada data from 2016. That's a really obvious kind of pointer, or the value of combining the two and seeing what we might be seeing in terms of connections between economic performance, unemployment rates, social safety challenges from let's say racism or systemic discrimination reports. Are there connections between these things? Hate speech on Twitter, and then connecting that with calls for service, etc. We have the ability now to use AI to advance the equity agenda as well. And of course, from a practical perspective, if we know what challenges are happening in real time, we'd be able to obviously deploy resources in a much more fine-tuned way as well. Tech responses to COVID now, and things that we're seeing across the country that are becoming much more expected and likely to continue post-COVID as well. So the social sector has obviously been tremendously affected by COVID, because we've obviously got additional demand for support, yet are not able to deliver it in the same way. So what we've seen in terms of adaptations that have gone better or worse in some communities and contexts. So I don't want to say these are best practices. These are just tech responses from a social end to COVID. So obviously the virtual service delivery side has become quite common for all of us. The Zoom experience, doing Zoom assessment and not Zoom, but virtual assessment, digital platforms to actually do our service delivery has become very, very common for lots of case managers, psychologists, those of you that are able to do those assessments. I'm sure you are already, but also just as part of the wellness check. So being able to call folks instead of needing to book an appointment with them has been another key piece. And of course that goes hand in hand with general responses to COVID. So the user experience in the economy has been increasingly digitized, right? So Amazon versus going to the store. The online shopping and the contactless delivery of supports and goods. That's, again, something that we see in the social sector and the general economy, where food hampers, for instance, are delivered to isolated seniors versus contactless, and coordination is done through an app versus, again, in person. Contactless payments as well, so social assistance benefits, emergency benefits, again, much less being done in person at government offices. And then remote work and education, which I'm sure this is part of your guys' PD as well, but that movement of the workforce remotely, and that being something that's likely going to stay for the social sector, not just the broader society and economy as well. So health, I'm sure you guys have done your telehealth check-in as well, but also the remote patient monitoring of discharged patients as well. So being able to do the follow-ups with clients and or patients online. The virus contact tracing, and I know there's tons of pros and cons from a privacy perspective to some of that, but that has certainly been accelerated by COVID. Systems mapping has really, at least for us, has really blown up in the past 6 months. I don't think that's why we went from 100 to 200 in a couple of months, because there's been an increasing demand for supports and services to become visible digitally to those looking for assistance. So not understanding what the system looks like, because we've been relying on word of mouth or person-to-person conversations. That having been forced to become transparent and online has put demand on those of us who do work in the systems mapping space to do that much quicker and to amplify our reach to support the efforts on the ground, because systems mapping is quite critical to emergency responses. If you don't know what's operating in your community, how can you possibly leverage it in a response? The supply chains as well, and this is obviously much more on Ashif's side of the presentation, but you obviously have heard of things like Internet of Things, so the ability for us to actually trace objects and objects to be able to talk back to us, so that your Alexa and your Hey Googles in your homes, those would be examples of the Internet of Things and how these things are becoming smart as well and connected to each other. So that is also something that we're seeing more and more of, the ability to leverage bots for the delivery. So sorry, not bots, but drones, pardon me, for the delivery of products, etc. I talked a little bit about big data, blockchain, and this is very much connected to the concept of sovereign ID or open ID, where you can have a digital ID that's protected through blockchain technology, so that you're able to have enhanced access to services and have a passport of your assessment, so that you're not having to do the same thing over and over again. Cloud computing and things that used to be, I need my own server in my basement. That's obviously something very much of the past, but that shift in supply chains is ongoing and will continue to scale, I'm sure. Then hygiene and sanitation. So increasing reliance on these touch-free devices, so that we're, again, touch being from a COVID perspective being an issue, PPE innovation as well in this space in terms of sanitation, and this whole virus screening as well. So increasing innovations in this area to trace the virus, but also to make sure that we're able to screen as much as we can touch-free, so thermometers, et cetera, and automating that so we can do it at scale as well. Data science and policy. So all of the modeling that you guys see and the forecasting that you see, that's all the data science use of big data and looking at the connections between different data sets simultaneously to support responses. Mental health and well-being, domestic violence and sexual violence. We're involved in some big data projects to start predicting some of these challenges before they occur, so that we can intervene more proactively as well and influence policy with that. So rather than having a blunt policy instrument where we use population distribution, having a much more nuanced approach to it to say, well, if we know that we have an increased risk for this to occur in a particular jurisdiction, why would we not double down in that jurisdiction to prevent that from occurring before it occurs? So all of this, of course, has been accelerated by COVID. I'm not saying that none of this would have happened without COVID, but these are just in overdrive right now. So again, if we had predictions, and I'm not sure that these are predictions, but these are considerations moving forward. And you heard this, remote work is going to become normalized in our sector. Our Home work boundaries will continue to blur. I don't know about you, but I don't think I have a home life that's distinct anymore from work. It's all kind of just, it's all the same in some ways. So that's going to pose very different demands on our time, and in our division of our work and personal self are going to be challenged. Virtual service delivery becoming to become a best practice. And what I mean by that is, what does a best practice in service virtual delivery look like? We don't know that yet. It's something that we do on a haphazard basis right now. We're reacting. It's not necessarily systemic or systematized and studied. We're going to have to get on top of that and figure out what exactly the right process is. Digital presences from a marketing perspective. So if we're not relying on people to see our agency's front shop as part of our presence and our connection to end users, we're going to have a very strategic marketing approach to ensure we have a digital presence. And again, in the digital space, you're competing with the big corporations that have major budgets for marketing, and charities and nonprofits, social enterprises don't necessarily have that. So how are we going to be able to have our share of the marketplace to ensure that our end users know about what's available to them? Environmental impacts are going to be very interesting as we rely less on office buildings and commuting, which is not necessarily a bad thing. On the other hand, we now have these mass empty office buildings. So there's lots of innovative repurposing solutions to those office buildings, especially for underhoused or homeless populations that could benefit from those sites. So is that something that we want to be leveraging further? New social contracts and intent around social distancing and social interaction. So again, how we're going to be pivoting the work of the social impact sector when social distancing and limitations on social interactions are going to become the norm. So civic engagement in this day and age is going to have to move increasingly online. So how do we do that and maintain our responsibilities and as part of the social safety net? The labor market impacts, so the increased debt on our populations that we serve, and financial pressures, especially as government itself is being challenged by increasing debt. That's going to have a mass impact on us. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next year. We're going to pay for it. And those that are vulnerable are going to pay the price unevenly. So for us, it's about preparing for that ramification longer term. We're just starting to see what the crevices are going to be looking like from the experiments that government has rolled out in terms of its expenditures in response to COVID. Yet we know those expenditures are not sustainable, and that means that money is going to have to come from somewhere, or going to have to get cut from somewhere. So keeping our eye on that and being ready for when that wave of a demand increases is going to be a consideration. The demand for trust at a distance. So how do we build legitimacy when we don't necessarily have the face-to-face? And how do we do that using technology for good? And I think I mentioned this throughout my presentation, the unequal impacts of the virus on underserved, marginalized populations, that Indigenous populations, racialized communities, those that are experiencing mental health and addictions, etc. Those are all going to be uneven. And so our work and our application of technology has to have an intersectional equity lens in particular. So those are my remarks in terms of what I'm seeing from a social tech B Corp perspective, but I really look forward to seeing what the other presenters have to say as well. A note, of course, that if you are somebody that's looking for assistance or wanting to see what these systems mapping solutions look like, I think you're probably all familiar with our slate of apps that try to take that human-centered approach and are accessible. And I think our app is in 24 languages now, and more, obviously more to come all the time. Again, it's not something that's necessarily profitable, but it's something that makes sense from from an equity perspective as well. So how do we ensure that we have transparency of the social service net and do that in diverse languages as well? Here's some of the examples of our contribution to some of these, the big data discussions, and ensuring that tech is being leveraged for social policy, smarter social policy, but still having that equity lens to tech development simultaneously as well. So a bit about our systems mapping platform. If you haven't checked it out, just go to Google helpseeker.org or Google us and find us and check out some of the projects that we do. Love your thoughts on any of these as well. Yeah, so I think that brings us to James and his presentation. Like I said, James and I actually wrote some really I think they were interesting. I don't know. I hope they were interesting to people. Some papers on social impact sector and AI as well. So he's going to take it away and share some of his thoughts with you. And James, if you want to introduce yourself and the community, the Institute for Community Prosperity at MRU, that'd be awesome. I'm sure people would love to hear that as well. So over to you now.
Great. Thank you so much, Alina. And thank you for bringing us together. It's pretty rare to have conversations that kind of bring the social space and the tech space together. So really cool to take advantage of this. So just very briefly about what we do at the Institute. We try and connect students with social impact learning through applied community partnered research, creative knowledge mobilization, and systems-focused education. So we're interested in big questions about how we invest in social purpose or the common good in the 21st century. So how can we and the change makers of tomorrow develop practical, actionable skills as well as networks, creative confidence that communities need, not merely to bounce back from COVID, but to flourish in the future? So maybe, Alina, I'll get you to just kind of click again, which will kind of activate an array of initiatives that we're involved in. So we do everything from in-class social innovation education to practitioner-focused learning to managing Canada-wide systems mapping competition, senior undergraduate leadership development, applied co-produced publications, community co-produced publications, future casting, to a upcoming podcast series on Indigenous change makers in Treaty 7, which is produced by my colleague, Latasha Kaffaro. So one of these, I'll get you to click through again. One of these co-produced publications was with Alina and her colleague Camilo. So we were interested in the growing importance of artificial intelligence, or AI, in all of our lives and our communities, yet the relative silence on the topic in the social sector. And when I say social sector, that's kind of shorthand for nonprofit, social profit, voluntary, more broadly civil society. So I kind of use those terms interchangeably throughout. But we called this piece In Search of the Altruism. So we made up that word. The exploratory report is free. It's free to download on either of our websites. And the main point here, and I'll get you to click twice just so the whole quote goes up. We said, AI can be made to be generative, beautiful, and not merely ethical, but rationally compassionate and just, enriching our lives beyond what we can currently imagine. But it will only do so if civil society, including citizens living at the margins, and people involved in social good pursuits, from artists, teachers, to health professionals, social workers, become much more interested and involved. That's kind of our main takeaway. But the other thing we did in the report is we looked back a little bit at the history of previous industrial revolutions. So Alina mentioned we're in the fourth industrial revolution. Well, that means that there were 3 prior industrial revolutions. And we dig into those from the perspective of what was the relationship between how we thought about social good and how society moved forward in terms of technological and industrial action. And I'm even hesitant to say advancement, because in some ways it's not an advancement. And so I'll give you an example. So back up about 50 years to the 1970s, where You saw we saw the dawn of robotics in heavy industry. We saw things like word processing. We saw the very early days of the personal computer. And at the same time, over in the kind of social good space, it was largely still operating based on Victorian norms. So at least 50 years kind of behind the times, if you like, in terms of the mindsets and mental models and the assumptions that go into that. Some would argue we're still in a Victorian mindset. I think we're kind of moving out of that. But the point is, we've always been, I think, in the kind of social sector, in a way, kind of playing catch up, or also being kind of the cleanup crew to the detritus of industrialization, right? So we're there to raise the alarm bells or to try and clean up the damage to ecosystems, the damage to human communities. And our point is we can't afford to do that anymore. We actually have to be at the leading edge, at the vanguard, and that means being at the table in all kinds of conversations around tech. So, by the way, we've written some other pieces, again, free to download in The Philanthropist, Canada's online magazine for the nonprofit practitioners. We've done some stuff with Future of Good. And you can also see a webinar that dives into AI a little bit more on the Alberta Social Innovation Connect website. So I'm not going to repeat really much more around AI specifically, but I did want to highlight two examples. So one of them is up on the screen here, and that is, so this, as we think of what's happened the last few months, not just COVID, but the resurgence of Black Lives Matter, the defund police movement. What does this have to do with tech? So here's one example. Kamran Khan, a U of T researcher, he actually developed an AI algorithm that predicted the Wuhan virus spread, where it would spread, how it would spread, even before the World Health Organization. So another one, I'll get you to click again, Alina, is just down the highway from where I am in Edmonton. The police chief there, Dale McPhee, they, a few weeks back, launched a new initiative that will be amalgamating data, big data, AI, machine learning, to combat crime in a new way. So it's going to focus on the interconnected challenges underpinning criminal activity, including addictions, homelessness, mental health. So in a way, it can be kind of viewed as a proactive defunding. So this is called the Community Solutions Accelerator. It's very exciting. And I think it's worth reading Police Chief McPhee's quote to the media when it was launched, where he said, "We cannot continue to do things the same way and expect a different outcome. We need to think differently, act differently, and take some risks if we want to see real results for the vulnerable people in the community." So I think that's a really kind of forward-looking and courageous statement. But I want to back up the scope and look at three of the major gaps, or more appropriately, chasms, that prevent us as a society from really bringing tech and social good together. So despite these cool examples and many others, there's some big factors that prevent us from having a robust, generative, tech-embedded social R&D ecosystem. So I'll get you to click again. So the first chasm is the gap between what I'm calling social research and social development, or you could view it as the gap between academic social science research and, on the other hand, community practice and insight. So on the left side, the one side, you have discipline-bound knowledge. I would extend this to well beyond the social sciences, by the way, like professional faculties such as social work, business, even computer science are just as guilty of this. So you have narrow problem definition, typically, an obsession with theory. The culture of the university, advancement, tenure, and promotion are tied disproportionately to academic publication, irrespective of how many people read the publication, its understandability to practitioners, or its potential for application. And perhaps most egregiously, most of these publications sit behind paywalls. Although, kudos to MIT and a handful of other universities for challenging us to follow its lead in requiring open access publication. So All universities talk a good line around community engagement, but in most contexts, it is perfunctory and mechanical. The one exception I think I should point out is with respect to commercialization of intellectual property. This is where most of the tech innovation conversation resides. But while commercialization does have its place, it's a minor player. So according to one UK estimate by the think tank Nesta, only about 5% of identified social innovations lend themselves to commercialization. So on the other side of this divide, you have social good organizations, nonprofits, charities, with almost zero opening conditions for R&D to thrive. You have funder-driven impact measurement that dominates over experimentation. There is seldom a research culture in such organizations. Most can't afford to hire data scientists or data specialists. And there is, frankly, a low tolerance for failure, much, much lower than in the commercial sector. Next slide. So how might we unite these into a strong social R&D ecosystem, and what might it look like? So at minimum, there would be strong learning cultures within social impact organizations with dedicated in-house research capacity, including, importantly, data science. Funders would support experimentation and build a trust-based, open communication where learning from failure replaced the current dance of deception. Universities, colleges, polytechnics would value interdisciplinarity more than they do, and application, not just commercialization. So alongside rewarding open access, collaboration, knowledge translation, mobilization, cross-embedding of practitioners and research, and here governments can play a role too. So governments often say they value these things, but their actions largely say otherwise. New slide. So the second chasm here is the divide between social innovation and tech innovation, or you could call it technopreneurship. So Canada actually has a world-leading record in AI science and other forms of tech innovation. You look at the University of Alberta, University of Toronto, Montreal. We are increasingly recognized globally as well as a powerhouse in social innovation. However, social innovation is not tech innovation, and we have so far failed to bring these worlds together effectively. So people working on social innovation occasionally consider the role of tech, and people working in tech innovation occasionally are motivated by social purpose, but they largely work in their own worlds. So I have a picture of Jane Jacobs on the screen here, and I use it because to me it's a historical analog. So Jane Jacobs, of course, was a major mobilizer of citizens and reformer of how we think about cities. And so when post-war cities were built, fueled by a kind of exuberant modernism and a kind of blithe embrace of the liberating promise of the future, this kind of linear sense that the future will always be bolder and better and brighter. We made the mistake of turning to so-called experts to manage the city building process. So the transportation engineers, the architects, overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly white, who basically said, leave it to us. So what do? They overbuilt cities, they trashed heritage, they warehoused people living in poverty, in gleaming edifices that ironically serve to intensify urban violence and decay. They ignored the nuance of city life at the neighborhood level. They had blind spots around race and ethnocultural diversity, little regard for the ecological footprint of their creations, and so on. All in the name of good, by the way, all in the name of social progress. So Jane Jacobs, pictured here, represents the coming together of this empirically informed expert insight with citizen advocacy and experience. So I want to quote here, there's a philanthropy futurist, Lucy Bernholtz, who's a brilliant writer. And it's worth reading her quote. She says, there's no clean room for social innovation, and clean is in quotes. She says, it takes place in the inequitable, unfair, discriminatory world of real people. So no algorithm, machine learning application, or policy innovation on its own will counter that system, and it's past time to keep pretending they will. We need mediated and new collaborative spaces where the relationships, trust, and shared platforms for ideas and experiments can flourish. and where radical, even revolutionary action can emerge. So we must ask ourselves, to what extent is high tech following similar patterns? Is the development of algorithms relentlessly open and inclusive? How participatory are our social hackathons? Are we speaking across disciplines and including the voices of those closest to the problem we're trying to hack? And are social innovators and tech innovators in the same room? The answer to these questions is usually no. So the development of social purpose tech, I think, should not only include computer scientists, software engineers, data scientists, but also should involve sociologists, social workers, philosophers, human rights lawyers, economists, historians, many other vocations, and moreover, the end users of such services or interventions ought to be at the table too, not merely experts or service providers. So here's where human-centered design, at a minimum, comes in. I'll quote one other person, Mark Laterano, who's a Harvard Technology and Human Rights Fellow. And he says, the fanfare around too many AI projects smacks of tech solutionism, which can mask root causes and risks of experimenting with tech solutions on vulnerable people without appropriate safeguards. Tech companies that seek out to develop a tool for the common good, not only in their self-interest, soon face a dilemma. They lack the expertise in the intractable social and humanitarian issues facing much of the world. But we have an opportunity, I believe, in Canada for world-leading integration of social innovation and tech development. So let's seize it. And then finally, the third chasm is, this is a bit more meta. So I'll get you to advance the slide one more time, Alina. So this is a bit more meta. But ironically, I actually think it's the one where I think we're seeing the most progress. And it's a divide between what I call systems thinking and mechanistic thinking. So what you see on the screen is actually a very old diagram that was, it represents the ideas of Auguste Comte, the 19th century philosopher of science. And he noted that as you departed from the kind of elegant realm of pure mathematics, astronomy, physics, through biology, then ultimately into the science of understanding human social structures and systems, what he labeled sociology, the complexity increases and the ability to introduce general rules decreases. So click again. The physicist shown here, Neil Turok, who delivered one of the best lectures on social innovation, I think, as part of a Canada 150 traveling roadshow a couple years ago. You can watch this on YouTube, by the way. He kind of updated Kant's observations, noting that the realm of human beings and human interaction is exponentially and intimidatingly complex and messy relative to the extremes of the very large or small. So the quantum realm or the cosmos, which are much more elegantly mathematical and precise. So click again. So this may seem obvious, but the implication is that the ability of finite sequences of defined implementable instructions, what we might call algorithms, becomes much more fraught in the realm of human services. Anyone who thinks they can just port knowledge from science and tech over to the social realm without appreciating this nuance, diversity, and complexity is, of course, asking for trouble. As Mark Laterano notes, the last thing society needs is for engineers in enclaves like Silicon Valley to deploy AI tools for global problems they know little about. As just one example, we know there are at least 257 predictors for suicidal behavior. The intensity of these variables calibrate differently based on race, or age, or gender, culture, geography. So 50 years ago, this would have scared off even the most dogged techno-solutionary, but in today's context, it actually doesn't. But the good news is that the study of computer and information science itself has been in its own dance with complexity science. So as you see neural networks, unsupervised or semi-supervised machine learning, other complexity embracing technologies, it's actually not so audacious anymore to propose tech solutions to social problems. Indeed, there's teams in Florida, University of Toronto, who are actually applying AI algorithms to this very challenge of suicide prevention with some interesting early success. So The flip side of Laterano's critique is that the social sector appreciates the role of those in tech who've brought world-changing models to what we now take for granted. So think of open source software, wikis, peer-to-peer, blockchain, and so on. But what really is required here is a shift in our mental models from the mechanistic thinking of Newton, Descartes, where measurement, quantification, logical linear sequences reign supreme, towards systems thinking. So I'll get you to click one more time. There's a great book that I've been reading by Fritjof Capra and Pierluigi Luisi called The Systems View of Life. It's a couple years old. It's really more of a deep ecology kind of thrust, but it's a great overview of how Enlightenment thinking actually got us into our current global mess, and how we might think about coming out of that mess. So it's important to note both mechanistic and systems thinking requires data, but systems thinking involves much more data. It also involves identifying relationships and interrelations, recognizing patterns, understanding context. Mapping is the key analytical skill. So in sound systems thinking, processes are tied that are tied to social innovation. Among other ingredients, history matters, power and privilege matters, and by extension, dynamics of inclusion and exclusion. Lived experience matters as a source of critical insight. So the implications of systems thinking are many and vast, but it will be bound to lead us into very interesting places like new ownership and governance models, better existential risk assessment, 7 generations planning, biomimicry and design, circular economy potentially. And I believe that the integration of systems thinking and social innovation with high tech may also help kind of depoliticize and accelerate difficult decisions based on social science evidence and behavioral insights. So for example, we know criminalizing drugs doesn't have any useful social function. We know prisons in their current present form don't really work. We know homeless people cost our public emergency intervention systems gobs of more money than if people had a safe place of their own to live. We have increasing evidence that food security is only really solved through income security, which also, by the way, is necessary for entrepreneurship and innovation to flourish. So with this, I say, let's get going.
Thank you so much, James. That was awesome. And now, Ashif Maui from Rising Tide, really look forward to your thoughts and remarks. And yeah, if you give us some background about Rising Tide, but also your involvement with some of the work happening in Edmonton around innovation and the partnership with the Edmonton Police Commission as well, that I'm sure people would love to hear about that.
Sounds good. Thanks, Alina, and thanks, James, for your remarks. Happy to provide some insight today, and I'll focus today more on something James alluded to, which is the Community Solutions Accelerator, which is a partnership between the Edmonton Police Foundation and a number of other partners, EPS being one of them, ATB, TELUS, UFA, AMI, Motorola Solutions, and the Government of Alberta. So I'll touch on that a little bit. But by way of background, so my background, I'm a serial entrepreneur, built and sold a number of different companies in the tech space. And then, since then, if you will, I've been more a venture capitalist and investing in sectors around the world, whether it's tech, healthcare, real estate, etc. But part of my philanthropic role is I chair the Edmonton Police Foundation. And so, what I find interesting is when you bring the different elements together, you bring community partners, you bring data, and you bring artificial intelligence, machine learning, you bring entrepreneurship to the table, you get some really magical things happening. So I'll touch on that today. We'll go to the next slide, please. So CSA, or the Community Solutions Accelerator, and James alluded to it just earlier. So why did we start this? When Chief Dale McPhee came to Edmonton, him and I had a really good chat, and this was before he was officially the Chief of Police. He wanted to interview all the people that he would be working with, and the Police Foundation is one of them. And him and I had a really good chat, and it was around, if we do things the same way we've been doing them, for years and expecting different results, I'm not sure that that's going to work. So how can we think differently, but think differently in a very inclusive way, right? So again, it's bringing, I agree, I completely agree. If you just bring in AI practitioners and tech entrepreneurs, et cetera, to try and solve community problems, it's likely not going to work. But if you bring them along with the community partners that know that domain, knowledge, if you will, that have that domain expertise, I should say, and understand the problems in a very complex way, then there is a potential. Now, if you couple that with entrepreneurs that just think very differently and think out of the box, think creatively, just naturally, then you can get some solutions. So that was the reason behind the CSA. We know we have an abundance of data, and data used in the right way can yield some benefits. So we brought in partners like the University of Alberta because ethics is key. So if you design your solution with ethics in mind and with privacy in mind, then you can have the right solutions, that will consider all the things where there's natural biases in data. So depending on where you get the data from, et cetera. So part of the CSA was bringing in the right partners, okay, making sure that these partners share the same values. They have the expertise, they have the resources, and they have, the desire for the same outcomes. So we did form that, luckily, and we got some great partners. ATB as an example, TELUS, University of Alberta, Amy, Motorola Solutions, and then of course the EPS and the EPF. The Edmonton Police Foundation chairs the Community Solutions Accelerator, and they bring all these different groups together. So 3 challenges we've launched so far. The first one was around liquor store thefts. And you might wonder, well, how is that really a community problem? When you actually dig deep into liquor store thefts, and I'm not talking about the one-offs where, somebody walks into the store and they don't have the money to buy a bottle and they put it in their pocket. That's not what we're talking about here. This is more around the organized crime element of the liquor store theft, where, there's a systemic, there's a root cause, if you will. And it's what the police have told us is that they believe it's being done by organized crime. And they are recruiting people that have either an addiction to a substance, et cetera, and saying, if you want that particular product, go and do this for me, and go and pick these bottles, and then these bottles are then, sold to establishments, could be to restaurants, to bars, et cetera. So if you think about the root cause, these thefts are actually fueling addictions, right? And are fueling substance abuse, and are fueling organized crime, which yields more crime and so forth. So that was the reason why this challenge was accepted by the CSA. And what we did is we said, okay, well, we don't know the solutions to this. So why don't we go to the world? So we launched it on a platform called HeroX, HeroX.com, which is a great site. It's kind of like XPRIZE concept, basically. And so this allows the whole world to participate. Alcanna, which is one of the, I believe they're one of the largest providers of liquor stores, if you will. They wanted to be a big part of this because this affects them dearly, not just from a monetary standpoint, but more importantly from their staff. Their staff that work at the liquor stores would get these, intruders coming in, and some of them becoming violent and so forth. And it was a safety issue for them. So they really wanted to help in this. And so they contributed some money to it, and expertise and data. We launched the challenge, and we got an overwhelming response. We had over 250, I believe, responses come from worldwide. Different people collaborating. So we had teams and so forth. Net is we got some great solutions, some things that we would never have thought of. And so we then put together a group of independent judges from different domains, including EPS, the foundation, Alcanna, entrepreneurs, and so forth. And, shortlisted, and we had them pitch to us in a Dragon's Den type competition. which went really well. And we're in that final stages of that judging. So that was the first challenge. The next challenge was around mental health and fitness, and specifically around first responders. We know that the first responders that we have go through some pretty troubling things that they have to see and experience every day. And that takes a toll on their mental health. Wellness and fitness is a big part of it. So what we're doing now is the first part of the challenge was to gather requirements, saying what should we be asking for? And that went around the world, and we got some great submissions. The next part is now actually building that or finding if there is a commercial solution to that. Now, what we're trying to do with the CSA is make it sustainable. So we're going to have the ecosystem. We're going to have the data in a very secure way and handled only by accredited professionals, enhanced clearance, NDAs, and so forth. Then we're going to have AI practitioners that will work with them, and they will create the models, etc. We're going to invite entrepreneurs that want to be a part of this and they want to help commercialize this. The end result will be this solution that may or may not work. And we've set the premise that this is a lab, this is research and development, this is entrepreneurship. More things will fail than success. Okay, so there'll be more failures than there'll be success. And we've set that tone. So the expectations are set. So don't expect every project we do to be successful. In fact, expect most of them to fail. And when you set that tone, it allows a lot more freedom. Government itself cannot fail. Healthcare can't fail. Law enforcement can't fail. But a lab can fail. And so when you allow for that thinking, it allows for more open, and creative approaches. And so that's what we're doing. Now, assuming a venture succeeds, well, that entity will have the CSA to provide the data, et cetera, and its first customer. So in the example of the liquor store theft, if there's a solution that's going to work, Alcanna will be its first paying customer. So if you think about it from an entrepreneur standpoint, they have the domain expertise, they have the data, they have the problem, they have the market, they have the fit, they have the first customer, paying customer. And so if I'm an entrepreneur, this is, the magic portion, if you will. This is everything I need to be successful. And we know that. And so we've structured it in that way so that when that company then launches, the only thing the CSA looks for is some sort of a royalty, something to keep us self-sustaining so that we don't have to keep fundraising and so forth, and we can launch more challenges and so forth. So that's kind of the whole life cycle, if you will, for the CSA. We'll go to the next slide, Lena. So I've talked about a couple of the challenges. The next challenge we're working on right now, which is quite unique, and we've got Motorola Solutions kind of running it from a human-centric design. And it's around, it's around homelessness, and it's around the effects of COVID on that population. What has happened so far, what's going to happen. So there's a little bit of a predictive, how does this world change, and how does this affect our most vulnerable? And so we're looking at that, and we've got partners like the Bissell Center. We've got a couple of other folks, other community partners involved in there. ATB's helping in there, TELUS is helping in there, because we believe that this population needs to be connected. They need to have devices, they need to have the right resources at their fingertips, because things are going to move virtual. So that face-to-face interaction, et cetera, will still be there, but we're seeing that it's getting lesser and lesser. So if this population is not connected with the right resources at the right time, it could cause issues. So which is why TELUS and ATB are involved in there. And so we're going to look at it with the data. So we're bringing in data from different agencies and obviously applying artificial intelligence and machine learning. And the idea is to basically get these folks, and the chief used a great term, and I might misquote it, but he said something to the effect of, from a tax user to a taxpayer, which basically means, helping them become self-sustaining. So helping them get a job, helping them get accommodation, housing, accommodation, food, and so forth. So really helping them get off the off-ramp, okay? That highway of dependence, getting them to that off-ramp. And that's what this project is about. So we're in the early stages of that right now, but there's a lot of promise. And if you think about the market opportunity, it's huge. Every community faces the same issues. So if we can help solve it here, we believe that same model can work globally. So a lot of excitement, a lot of partners are really keen on helping on this. And so we'll see where it goes, but I have a good feeling about it. The progress so far is amazing. The other thing we want to tackle is obviously around addictions, and then finally is reduction in crime. So those are the key buckets that we're looking at. There'll be different projects that will come in along the way. We've got some great partners. So the government of Alberta is very keen on this. They want to be an active partner in this. We believe that, again, with the ethics and privacy design first. So everything we do, we'll ask ourselves the question, just because you can, should you? And that becomes the same question time and time and time again. So if we do it right, we'll think about all these things, and we are going to make mistakes. There's no question, but we will learn fast. So with that, Lena, I know we're running out of time, so I want to get into the Q&A. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I've wanted to hear lots about this innovation process in Edmonton for a long time. So like this was, I'm sure, very interesting to everybody else on the call as well. So actually that's good timing, because we have some time for Q&As now. So if folks have any questions that you have of the presenters or of anything that we talked about, please throw those in the chat, and Jenny will chime in. Also marking your calendars for August 20th. Our next webinar is going to tackle anti-colonialism and anti-oppression, so challenging systemic racism in Canada's social safety net. So we're chatting with some folks from that are working on Indigenous rights and obviously Black Lives Matter activities across the country. So if that's of interest to you, and even taking a close look at our own biases in the social impact sector, just because we work on social issues doesn't mean that we are not entwined with colonial projects and racist projects as well. So just again, taking a critical look at our work and how we can improve our ability to meet needs in an equitable way. So if that's of interest, by all means, chime in and put this in your calendars. I realize these webinars are happening during the summer months when folks might be away or doing coverage. So I know that Jenny's going to be following up with all of these being recorded, so folks can catch up as well. And everything's going to be on our YouTube channel as well for some of you who prefer to watch it that way. So Jenny, anything that we should be tackling as a first question?
Yeah, definitely. And just to, we just had a quick question come in that I'll just address right now. So the question was, how can I register for the August 20th webinar? So I will be sending out the link to all registrants along with the video over the next couple days. So Mustafa Kamal, who asked that question, I will send that over to you guys so you can go ahead and register in the next couple of days. So I'll keep you posted. Some of the questions that came through, we have a tendency of deploying AI systems first and then discovering the social harms later. How do we move to a mindset of do no harm, proving the system is unbiased first, and then deploying them?
I can take that.
Go for it.
That's exactly the issue that was raised to us. And so, within the CSA, we have two labs, if you will. The first lab will take all this data that will have sensitive information, but will only be handled by those with enhanced security clearance. And that will include ethicists. That will include people that will understand that there are built-in biases into the data. So how do you then eliminate that bias? right? So there's a concept of data cleansing, there's a concept of data anonymization. All those practices will be used so that the models are tested and tested and tested first in that lab before they move to the next stage, which is now using, more what I would call corporate data and business data and things like that, where, you can start doing some pilots and so forth. So the first step of cleansing should help remove all those, or most of those biases, I should say. And then the next stage of testing will then help us find anything left over. So that's the approach we're using.
James, do you want to take anything on that question?
Sorry, I have a lawnmower just outside.
No
So
worries.
apologies for the ambient noise.
Yeah.
I mean, only to say, nothing really to add to Afshe's answer, because that's where the rubber really hits the road. Other than just to reiterate, those points around kind of diversity and inclusion that I made earlier, just around, we need to make sure that more people are in the room on this stuff, and that there's both a kind of, like, not everyone needs to be a tech expert, right? So I think that's one source of intimidation, is that, well, okay, if I have a human service career, and we know well that the most human service organizations have historically been experiencing a digital divide. That's narrowing for sure, but usually it was like you got the leftovers, and there wasn't much active encouragement to be tech literate, be tech savvy, and so I think that's translated over time, and it goes even deeper than that, right? Many people enter helping professions to help, but some are partially motivated because they're scared of math and they didn't want to go down a kind of STEM pathway, and so there are deep reasons why people may be also fearful of technological conversations, but the point is we need to overcome that and get involved. And I think, my sense is that, whenever we have these conversations, it's actually disproportionately people in the tech world who are very interested in having this conversation and who are really enthusiastic about the take up. So I think there's a willing and ready receptor there. We just need to be more confident and more inclusive.
Wonderful.
I think for us, just a couple of ways we try to tackle it, because we develop AI and those kinds of tools as well. I think if you have a social enterprise lens, like there's certain standards you have to meet in your policies and in the way you work. So the piece around equity and diverse perspectives should manifest in the kinds of folks that are working on the AI itself. So if an Indigenous person that's engaging in exploring AI tools is going to bring a very different perspective than a white heterosexual male, for instance. So I think that our hiring practices need to line up with these values as well, so that people actually developing the AI are part of the solution as well. So I think that's one piece for us, is those of us that are working on it. And then also our team. So our development team has to work with our social research team. So because it's bringing the IQ up of those that are math averse, but vice versa, bringing the social equity lens to the project from the get-go. So I think multidisciplinary teams are also part of the equation there. And then lastly, the way the data you ingest in AI needs to have been collected equitably as well. So it's almost like the procurement of data needs to line up to these values as well.
I just saw my screen there kind of going off in a really unflattering position, but so the other one is the kinds of like data and the way it's collected, the kinds of policies you have about data use, lining those up to OCAP principles. So I know that, for instance, if you're interested in this, we have a First Nations data policy as well, and how we maintain alignment with OCAP. So if the data might be there and it might be great data, but if it wasn't equitably sourced, that lines up to those values, then maybe we shouldn't use it, right? So it's just like that. I liken it to the supply chain, and let's say how Superstore was using, let's say, a slave labor, for instance, and how we as consumers of that product should be asking those questions. Or I think understanding the AI supply chain and how data was harvested, it should be part of that, and we should have policies to ensure that that's occurring. So those are some of the things that we're doing, but I know we can do more as well. So those are some thoughts.
There's a great document and set of resources. So if you look up the Montreal Protocol, I think it's called it's an AI protocol. It's a really interesting kind of ethical framework around AI. That's worth. I mean, there's other initiatives. This Future of Life Institute in Sweden also has some interesting resources. So there's certainly, and then the Canadian government is at a kind of multilateral level been quite involved in at least making the right kinds of signals and noise around AI and ethics. We'll see when the rubber hits the road, but there are a lot of really interesting generative conversations happening in that space.
And that really, we have a question here that kind of ties in with what you're referring to right now. And it's, does Alberta have a publicly published set of ethical principles on applying AI to social projects? Does anyone know about that?
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, not that I'm aware. Yeah,
no,
but what a great idea. Yeah, and not just Alberta, but just a Canada approach to this would be really useful. I know there's obviously these international, ethics around AI as well that the big tech companies are working on with governments, etc. But the social lens, that's what I think James was talking about. We tend to shy away from this world because we're not comfortable with it, but we need to be the driving force, or it's going anyways, right? And so the last thing we want to do is, again, and James and my paper on this stuff, looking at algorithms that kept suggesting that we should give racialized populations longer sentences because the AI showed that they reoffend. But that's because the data that was being used was racially biased data. So of course you're going to get that, right? So how would, but from the kind of technical perspective, the model was perfect. The model worked from a math lens, but not from an equity lens. So, if the conversations aren't happening, we're going to miss that boat completely. So, there you go, Canada. Thanks, Ushnish. Canada has a set of published principles, no enforcement mechanism. Yeah, there you go. So is there a way we can apply these voluntarily? And again, in our procurement of tech services, so let's give a competitive advantage to those companies that take these principles to heart and apply it to their work versus the ones that ignore them. So anyways, Ashif, did you have any other thoughts on this?
No, I think that's covered. Thank you.
We had a question come in, a question about the use of acute healthcare data to enrich the AI work towards social solutions. Privacy is important, but the acute care data can be revealing. Are there solutions pending?
So we are looking at that. We've, that's one of the partnerships is with Alberta Health Services, which is part of the government. So we are going to be bringing that in again in a responsible way, right? So, the chief had mentioned to me there was a project in Saskatchewan where they had brought healthcare data, social services data, and law enforcement data into a lab similar to the CSA over there that was there. And they yielded some amazing results around child protection and things of that nature. So there is good uses of that, but you have to be very careful in how it's used. So we're going to take that path in a very structured and very careful way.
Yeah. My other kind of thought on that is this whole concept of sovereign ID and digital solutions to the ID problem. And I think, again, blockchain has proven to be a very powerful tool in giving end users better protection of their data and better control of their own data. So if you think about how we interact with public systems right now, or even social services or private sector services as well, we give them data, they have our data, right? And there's not really an exchange. There's a, you need to give me this or you don't get my service. With Sovereign ID, the data control stays with us, with the citizen. And so our ability to have control of that through these digital or Sovereign ID tools, I think is going to be a game changer for all of us, not just those of us in the social space, but us as citizens, and will be a game changer in terms of our ability to control what happens and what is being used, what our information is being used for. So this is where kind of anarchist approaches to tech and the hacker movements that have been driving force in the sector, maybe more behind the scenes from what we see in our everyday experiences, have come up with innovations that will democratize technology further to enable us to gain some rights back from big tech as well. So I think for us to watch those developments and encourage those developments to give us as citizens more control over data and the protection of our data, so that we have a say in who's mining our data and how it's being mined for equitable or inequitable purposes is going to be really important as well.
And yeah, that's really great. It also, you know, that innovation will also create a kind of immutability so Canadians are pretty mobile, right? So they'll live in different cities and different provinces, and at different stages of life. And so, you know, you can imagine just on, say, vaccines alone and vaccine records, you know, having the information be immutable and ported and attached to you, so that A, you're aware at any time you want to be, and B, everyone else is aware because you only have one of that can't be broken or compromised. So I think that's great. And the other, just to say I mean, as an advertisement for our paper, although it's now almost a year out of date, we do have a section on healthcare in there. It's pre-COVID, so you know there's been a mushrooming of app development and innovations that have come since COVID. But you know, certainly we outline an array of some of the health innovations that are happening as a consequence of AI, and it's pretty encouraging stuff, especially around diagnostics. You know, the diagnostics going into the very near-term future will not exist without a kind of AI assistant or AI analog for doctors, because AI is already in certain niche areas outperforming medical practitioners, even specialists.
Great. This question came in and it was directed at Ashif. It's Edmonton Police Services used Clearview facial recognition software. How do we move away from blaming individual officers to recognizing the use of facial recognition by police as a systemic social justice issue?
You know, I can't really comment on that because I'm not part of the Edmonton Police. However, what I've learned is that there were a couple of officers, I think, that had downloaded whatever that application Clearview or Clearview is. They had gone to a conference, I guess, where Clearview was presenting, and they downloaded it and used it on test or fictional data, but it was never embraced by the EPS. So the EPS is a very rigorous process on how they vet technology and they look at it from an ethics and all that perspective. So they've never used it, you know, broadly, if you will, barring those two officers that used it. They downloaded it. And so I think they've taken corrective actions on making sure that you just can't download anything that you see at a conference and things like that. So
great. There's a question that came in. Is there a group working on AI and risk of suicide due to social isolation, closures of social service organizations, and erosion of the social safety net?
Yeah, totally. So that is part of the project I mentioned around homelessness. there's an element of suicide and what's happening now, what's going to happen come the fall, etc., when depression and things like that will set in a little bit more when the sun goes down and so forth. So they are looking at that as an element, and that might spin off into its own project because it's quite there's a lot of data coming in that's disturbing. So we want to get in front of that.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that?
I think though, Jenny, maybe we'll take one more just to keep us all on time to our next meetings and finishing up in the next 2 minutes, and then we can always write back a couple of things as well if additional questions come in. We can make sure the presenters get them. And we can follow up with some of these materials like the philanthropist paper and any other materials that folks mentioned that would be of value. Please send them on, and Jenny will make sure everybody gets them in our mail list, because I think they'll be really valuable for them. Okay.
The one last question that I had here was I think this is directed at everyone. Curious if you have partners in the Montreal area.
We don't, but we'd love to.
Well, we certainly, we partner with the McConnell Foundation right now to run a national-wide systems mapping competition, and it's literally called Map the System Canada. So that's on contract with McConnell Foundation, and what they do is they encourage universities, colleges, polytechnics to get student teams involved in understanding and engaging in systems mapping, specifically around social or environmental challenges. And then they support the costs of travel of those student teams and educators to come together somewhere in Canada every spring. And then for 2 of those winning teams to go on to Oxford University for a global competition. So that's a really cool partnership. And, like many people on the call, I'm sure, have been impacted in some way by McConnell's funding and thinking around some of this stuff. But beyond McConnell, not really any active partnerships right now.
We because our competitions are global in nature, we've had submissions from Montreal and from Quebec specifically on some of the challenges. So we're always partnering with any entity that's anywhere in the world. So we welcome all that.
I should add as well, Concordia, HEC, UQAM, we have relationships with various researchers or staff or administrators at those institutions, because I think they're all doing really interesting things around either community engagement or kind of social entrepreneurship.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank everyone, and what a great discussion and great questions from all of you. Like we said, we hope to see you at our next webinar on anti-racism and anti-discriminatory practices in Canada's social safety net. And Jenny's going to follow up, like I said, with the recording of this, as well as some of the materials that were referenced today. And yeah, we hope to see you next time. And in the meantime, please stay well and safe, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.